Welcome to this presentation. Mr. Berry, he is a graduate of Mackintosh College of the University of Oxford. So welcome back home. More recently, he has taken over as the vice chairperson of Niti Aayog. For those of you who know India, you know the Niti Aayog is the top economic policy think tank of the government of India. Mr. Berry reports directly to the Prime Minister himself and has the rank of cabinet minister in the government. And the entire organization is very, very influential in the direction of the country. So he has really a very deep insights into what is happening in the country today and the role of India in the future. So we're all looking forward to hearing some of that from him today. In particular, I think the timing is interesting because India has just taken over the presidency of the G20. And this is a very historic moment for India. I think it's also a very interesting time in the history of the world when a large emerging country like India takes over the presidency. What will India's contribution be in that role? How will India, in fact, make the world a better place is something which is on the agenda for the Prime Minister himself. I was actually in Gandhinagar recently for the G20 inception meeting, and it was very clear that there's a huge amount of excitement in the country, ambition about doing good, and certainly like to hear from him a little bit about these issues. Mr. Berry has a long CV, so I will not read all the details, but he has served as a member of the Prime Minister, the Economic Advisory Council before, India's Statistical Commission, and the Reserve Bank of India's Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. He has commented extensively in the media on economic issues and contributes a monthly column of a business newspaper. Welcome, Mr. Berry. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, and then we'll have an informal discussion.
Thank you, Dean Datta. Thank you for that welcome. And thank you to you and your staff for organizing this. But let me also acknowledge the role that I know that Lord Billamoria played in making this possible. And I'm very pleased that Lord Billamoria will join our conversation later. And also, I'm grateful to him for having very expertly steered a meeting at the House of Lords the other day. Thank you, sir. The focus here, as has been indicated, will be on the G20 and also India's economic outlook. But I would like to start by flagging some important messages about India's economic trajectory and also its relationship with the UK, even while recognizing that much of the student body at the Side Business School is global and multinational. So where is India at the moment? It's slightly amazingly, given that it had to deal with COVID and given that the war in Ukraine, it is a bright spot in the global economy. We can talk about how it ended up there, but it is expected to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world today. What that reflects is a series of wide-ranging structural and governance reforms, some of which I will cover. In particular, there's been a paradigm shift in public service delivery and implementation of government schemes and infrastructure projects in India, which have been responsible for its sustainable and inclusive growth, and perhaps of interest to the Side Business School. It's emerged as a preferred investment destination owing to many characteristics: strong democracy, political stability, business-friendly policies. Now, Dr. had talked about Niti Aayog's role in the Indian governance system. Just a word or two on that. The Niti Aayog replaced the Planning Commission, which was an institution set up by Prime Minister Nehru in 1950. And this was a decision of Prime Minister Modi when he took over in 2014. Niti Aayog was formally established on the 1st of January 2015. And it plays a variety of roles, but the one I want to showcase here is that it is a very important intermediary between the government at the center, what we call the union government, and the states. And an important message or an important takeaway I'd like to leave with this audience, and particularly those who I think have tuned in online, is that India's states are very important and for India's development, but they are also very consequential. So some of you would know, but others might not, that our largest state in terms of population, the Uttar Pradesh, it has the population of Brazil. A dynamic state in the south, Tamil Nadu, has the same population as Germany. Karnataka, the same population as, as the UK. Dry mouth. And it's not too far out to basically say that India's aspirations and India's growth depend on what happens in the states. Yes, the union government sets national policies, but many of the things that make for industrial development, quality of life, particularly urbanization, the investment climate, these vary from state to state. So just as a background for India before we get into the G20 and its aspirations, is for you to be aware that India, other than representing 1/5 of humanity, has a lot of diversity within. And indeed, a lot of Niti's role and the role of the union government is to manage this diversity of states within a vibrant democracy. And let me stress that third point, that India is a stable democracy and a popular government. Despite the diversity, we will have had by next year 5 full-term 5-year governments, that is at the center 25 years. And that kind of stability matters for investors, for the quality of life. And this is despite fiercely competitive elections. I'm talking now only of the parliamentary elections, but the turnout rate at about 66% is high, certainly by the comparison with a country like the United States. I don't know what turnout rates are like in the UK, but we're talking about an electoral system that is used actively by 540 million people, and the total electorate would therefore be about 800 million, and a female voter turnout of 65% or so. 85% of people have expressed in a Pew survey expressed trust in the national government, and a recent survey by a company called Morning Consult that was reported in the press is that Prime Minister Modi has an approval rating of 78%, highest among the 22 surveyed nations. This town, Oxford, is responsible for something that's called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is richer than just the usual poverty line indices, in that it includes things like health and education as well. And measured by that indicator, 415 million people escaped poverty between 2005-06 and 2019-21. Now, these are dry numbers, but what I just want to signal, and we can get into the details later because I do want to focus on the G20, that they represent a quantum leap in the capacity of the present government, but starting with its predecessor government, to deliver social services of various kinds at scale. And this has been made possible through the very imaginative and aggressive use of technology on public platforms. That, in turn, was facilitated by the decision which by the Modi government in 2014 to embrace an initiative launched under its predecessor of universalizing the what's called the universal identity card, the Aadhaar card in India. This may seem trivial in a society like the UK, but it's had enormous effects, because literally the issue, other than the identity of an individual as a voter, the legal identity or the personal identity of millions of Indians was not something that they could prove, and the Aadhaar card, as we call it, then, and the data associated with it, has become a very powerful machinery for the delivery of all kinds of services on public platforms, starting from financial services and then continuing to the delivery of health benefits, the impact of which has been to allow delivery at scale of a number of missing elements in the lives of particularly the poor in India. Now, let me now turn to the G20. A little bit about what the G20 is, what it means to be president of the G20, and how India is exploiting its chairmanship of the G20. So, firstly, about the G20. The G20 is known for its summit of leaders, because it is an entity that meets at the leader level these days once a year. But underneath it is a large structure of working groups. Since there are 19 countries, the 20th is actually it is the European Union, which does not hold the presidency. this was a institution that was created under the leadership initially of the United States and Canada at a time of financial crisis. First in 99, but was escalated to the leader level in 2008. Members hold the presidency by rotation, and this is the first time that India has come to hold the presidency. And as you know, it is a difficult moment in the global economy, because the G20 was not particularly effective in responding to the COVID crisis, followed upon by the consequences of the war in between Russia and Ukraine. India has communicated its goals for the G20 based, on derived from its slogan, which is that one planet, one future, one family.
The Steve and Lord Memorial, please join us. So we're very pleased that Lord Karan Memorial can also join us, because, as Mr. Barry said, he was instrumental in helping create this occasion for us to welcome Mr. Barry. Thank you for him joining us.
Pleasure.
He's also visiting executive in residence at Side School, and many important positions inside the UK, having been also the president of the British Confederation of Industry, and currently also the 7th Chancellor of the University of Birmingham. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So I have the pleasure of asking a few questions, but I also want to be fair to all of our viewers online. So for viewers online, you probably see the code menti.com. Feel free to enter your questions on that. If you feel comfortable, we'd love it if you mention your name and also location. And those questions will be routed to me on my mobile. We have also some members in the audience out here. Please raise your hand. We're happy to take some questions from you. So let me perhaps begin with a question for you, Mr. Barry. So clearly India has been as a bright spot in the global economic development. What can the world expect from India today, as India is heading towards good development targets, presidents of G20? So what can we expect from India's role in the world?
I think there is a question of how the world will be impacted if India continues on a particular trajectory. And then there's the question of what India is doing and expects to do as a responsible global citizen. The two are linked, but they're not quite the same. And if I could, structure my response accordingly. Prime Minister Modi has set the challenge for the nation, and I mean the nation, states, individuals, entrepreneurs, that there should be a collective effort to try and move India to developed country status by 2047, which would be 100 years after Indian independence. And let me observe that while India was very poor at the time of independence, it actually had a reasonably sophisticated bureaucratic structure, transport structure. It was one of the major industrial powers. So at one level, for us from then to have needed 100 years to become a developed nation is possibly an indictment of past government, of past policies. And so there's a need to, as it were, hurry up now. But we're attempting to do this, or will be attempting to do this, in a rather altered global environment from the past, particularly in respect of decarbonization and energy. And so, one answer to your question is what the world can expect from India is to, I won't use the term blaze a path, but to explore how you can develop under a decarbonization constraint. And that has many dimensions to it, both positive and negative. The positive dimensions are that much of the infrastructure that is needed is yet to be built, so we can use modern technologies. There's not a stranded asset kind of issue, so that's a positive. The negative is that a lot of the cheapest energy sources generate carbon, particularly coal. Okay, so rich countries got rich by doing two things. One is, basically clearing their forests and using coal in abundance, and therefore resulting in the stock of CO2 in the air being what it is. India has signed up to the challenge of using new technology to try and achieve similar quality of life following a different path. If it succeeds, and I hope it will succeed, and there's plenty of conviction behind the trajectory that it's intending to follow, that is a game changer, I think, which is not to say that by then China would not be equally green, maybe even more so. So I would say that's what is at stake for the world in India's aspirations and trajectory. I think the second response I had has been reflected actually in the last several years in terms of India's engagement with the less fortunate or the less sophisticated, whatever. A few examples. Of course, India has been an important part of UN peacekeeping forces for a long time. Second, it was, while it could, early on, more generous with the distribution of vaccines when they were needed, because it is an important vaccine producer. Even as recently as, even as contemporaneously as the Turkish earthquake, India has been, I think, one of the fastest countries to get support there. So I think these are two dimensions of India being a responsive global citizen while being a source of dynamism. There's one additional dimension that is perhaps worth mentioning, just by the accident of demography, which is that India will be the source of a large proportion, for a while, a large proportion of the growth in the professional labor force of the world, just because of the difference in its demographics. And this will have an impact on institutions like this, multinationals. So I think that over the next 20 years, to cite a slogan that was used at Davos once by the Indian contingent, it's probable that you're going to see India everywhere.
I remember that year very well when there were placards of that everywhere. We are starting to receive questions online already. And let me just pose a question. I'll come to you in a second, okay, in a few minutes. And maybe I'll come to you, Lord Villamoria, for this question from David Hall Matthews. And the question really is, how relevant is the G20 right now when so many of the G7 countries are plowing their own furrow? That's the question.
Great. Well, before I answer that, I should, in the House of Lords, I would declare my interest. And I must declare my interest that I'm a graduate of the other place. And so I'm a graduate of the other place. I'm a fellow of my college there, Sydney, Sussex, and our sister college here is St. John's, and which I've been privileged to visit. I'm also a former chair of the Cambridge Judge Business School for 5 years, and I'm a fellow there. And then more recently, I'm a fellow at Kellogg College here at Oxford, and also a visiting fellow here at the Saïd Business School at the Centre for Corporate Reputation. So when I spoke at the Kellogg Gordy a couple of years ago, I recalled a very well-known Indian economist who someone Aspire would definitely know. In a talk in India a few years ago, he said, you know, we talk as economists and statistics and averages. He said, well, if I have one foot on cold ice and the other foot on hot coals, on average, I'm comfortable. So I have one foot in light blue and another foot in dark blue. So I'm actually a true blue. So
I know.
So to answer the question, in fact, when you were answering the previous question that Sumatra you put across, I was president of the Confederation of British Industry, the equivalent of the CII in India, and in the B7 before the G7, we met in Berlin, and we had a meeting with Olaf Scholz in the lead up to Germany hosting the G7. And it just shows how instrumental, when you're in that position holding the presidency of the G7 or the G20. At that time, the Ukrainian ambassador here in the UK, who'd become a good friend, I'd worked very closely with humanitarian aid for Ukraine with British industry. And he pointed out to me in May last year, Karan, I don't think the world has woken up to the fact that our ports have been taken over by the Russians. We have one port left, Odessa, and Odessa is mined, and we have Russian submarines on the other side. We can't get anything out of Odessa. Unless that port is opened up, millions of people are going to starve because we can't get the grain out over land. And Ukraine being the food basket of the world, or one of the food baskets, people will starve. So I followed up straight away in Parliament. I got a chance to speak about it. David Beasley, the head of the UN Food Programme, at that very moment said 47 million people are in threat of starvation if that port is not unblocked. And I brought this up with Olaf Scholz face to face. He then brought it up at the G7. That then led to Turkey and the United Nations working together with Russia, and they agreed to back off and allow the ships to float. So that one thing, that one major initiative that came out of the G7, I think is going to save many, many lives. So it's a very powerful position to be in. And I think for India to be in this position, presidency of G20, at this time in history, when we've come out of a global pandemic, we've then got this sad war in Ukraine, the world has been in a crisis one after the other. I would say the biggest global crisis since the Second World War. And here's a country, as you said, that is a bright spot. We are barely, we're meant to be in recession. We've just heard we're not in recession, but we're predicted to grow this year at 0.7%. India's predicted to grow this year 6.5%, 7%. I mean, it's a different league. And so in that strong position, with, you said, 400 million people alleviated from poverty, with the per capita GDP going up, with your forecast from 1940 to be in 100 years, in 2047, to be a developed country. Another target you have is within 25 years, India to have a GDP of $32 trillion, making it the second largest economy in the world. And I spoke in a debate on Ukraine yesterday in the House of Lords, and one of the points I made was looking ahead at the world order. You have two superpowers in the world today. One is the United States of America, and the other one, whether we like it or not, is China. But looking ahead, we've got India that is emerging and will be a superpower. And I think the closer the relationship that India can have with countries like the UK going forward is going to have a huge, huge influence. So India's in a very powerful position to take a leadership role in an increasing way over the coming years and decades.
Without being unfair to other questioners, may I want to respond on the G20 issue? As it happened, when I was in the think tank world, I spent a fair amount of time, not related with either my present job or the Indian presidency, assessing the G20 in the decade from 2008 to 2018. This was a contribution at the time of the Buenos Aires summit, and got the opportunity to interview various actors in the G20. So at that time, and this is why the performance in the last 2 years has been disappointing, at that time my conclusion was that firstly, it is at least a spare tire, which these days even Mercedes doesn't provide, but at least a spare tire in global coordination, because it softens human relationships. And that was the great power of the G7, is the great power of the G7. As the old song said, who are you going to call? And the fact that Prime Minister Modi is now comfortable picking up the phone to people who become his peers, I don't think you can minimize the importance of that. And second, it may seem a trivial issue, but apparently is important, and its importance was symbolized by this handshake between President Biden and President Xi. It takes a huge effort to schedule bilateral meetings at a summit level. There's a lot of hoopla, there's a lot of protocol, etc. To have one date in the calendar where the good and the great know that they can transact business in an interconnected world. I think possibly you would have to invent it. So and then there is this important, if intangible, outcome of political consensus. So I think the political consensus, as Lord Bilimoria has said, on food, it's also name and shame. I think that Turkey and Russia, both members of the G20, there was a context within which they could be lobbied by their G20 peers. So these are soft dimensions, but I would say that in a world in churn, it would be silly to discard them.
Well, I think you've both provided excellent examples of the importance of G20 and also the importance of India in this process. Let's take a question from the audience. Just say your name and keep the question brief, please. The microphone is there.
So I'm Anuj, and I have worked with Niti Aayog and Planning Commission as a consultant previously, and right now I'm a student of Global Healthcare Leadership inside Business School. So my simple question here is that there, you talked about environment as well as vaccine policy that the country adopted. Now, with the economic crisis that the world is right now facing, how, as a G20 leader, does India plan to seek consent on something like environment with Mr. Modi in the leadership?
Well, two quick responses. One is, and I make this point wherever I can in the UK. I mean, there is a sense in India, rightly or wrongly, that the way COP26, right? Or Glasgow was 26? Yeah. That the way in which the UK press represented India's position in the conclusion of COP26 was somewhat unfair, and that, frankly, India has very powerful green credentials, notwithstanding the fact that it's a much less affluent country than the G7 countries, and indeed much less affluent than all other members of the G20. So against that background, we need to be clear that Prime Minister Modi is an absolute evangelist for sustainability, but he interprets that perhaps more broadly than the normal formulation, which at least in the G7 has just been mitigation, mitigation, mitigation. His formulation is that, and he does this as a very successful politician, and we've seen that both in Europe and here, when there was a need to, when energy prices skyrocketed, that basically all kinds of emergency action had to be taken. So the G20 is what we might call a holistic body looking at growth and development across the board, and therefore something called the Sustainable Development Goals is a better framework for thinking about it than something like the COPs, which are exclusively focused just on climate change. But the point I wanted to make was that equipping the world to deliver on the climate challenge is a central focus of this G20, but the focus is on several dimensions, but most importantly on financing the energy transition. And so it's become increasingly clear that what the energy transition will need, particularly in the South, but more in emerging markets, is a big investment push. That investment push will need cheaper financing than commercial terms, and the question of what is the world's Marshall Plan for dealing with a whole range of environmental stresses, including mitigation and adaptation, that's the central issue on the table. How to reconcile that with legitimate development aspirations, and then the whole apparatus of the various working groups, etc., it will be deployed towards that goal. I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe we need to move on.
Lord Billamore, would you like to comment on the number of questions on the climate dimension?
Yeah, so just just to build on what Ms. Very just said, which is spot on. In Parliament, you said day before yesterday how India is committed to net zero by 2070. But the huge opportunity here, and this is where G20, to your point of bringing everyone together, is the opportunity for everyone to work together. Now, the phasing out and phasing down was a big issue at COP26, but the reality is it's being phased down. And I always say it's being unrealistic it's a transition. It's not an on-off switch. We can't just suddenly switch from fossil fuels to alternative. It's got to be a transition. The big opportunity is India as a leader in solar power. We here in the UK are leaders in wind power. We've got huge now technology in heat. I chaired the Heat Commission. Hydrogen, India's made in its budget an absolute declared priority of research in hydrogen. Birmingham University, yes, and production. So Birmingham University, where I'm Chancellor, at COP26, we showcased the world's first retrofitted hydrogen-powered train. Now, the potential for that is huge. We're collaborating with the Indian Railways as well. So that sharing of technology, countries like India can take leadership in, I think there's enormous potential.
I think in the climate, as you both of you correctly identified, there are both challenges and opportunities, and I think by working together is the best benefit
The
of
finance point that Mr. Berry made is very important. Again, London being such an important financial center, climate finance, again, partnering with countries like India is another big opportunity.
Great. Can we wait for the microphone to come to front? And then, yes, please. Introduce yourself and just the name and brief question.
Yeah. Good evening, Mr. Berry. I think I should Siddharth Sethi. I think I'll begin by saying that as the world heads into recession, India is fairly well insulated and very well set up for growth. So I think the government and the Niti Aayog has done a great job over the last many years, and that's really paying off. My question is around the fact that in the world we talk about 4 trends and we call it the 4Ds. So it's decarbonization that we spoke about, digitalization, there's a demographic trend which is happening, aging population, and deglobalization. And my question is around deglobalization, and I ask this because I feel that India is presented by a golden opportunity and a potential to leapfrog China. So I would ask you, how are we as a country equipping ourselves to be able to deal with this trend and effectively take advantage of this trend? And in the end, I would say I will start a house as well, and that you will get.
Oh,
Right. Do I do leapfrogging? I'm not sure. So, there's an opportunity to learn from and avoid mistakes, and so one could characterize the traditional development path as being damage and then rebuild. Okay, and there's a concept called the environmental. So what we know is that rich countries are typically leave less of are better at protecting the environment than poor countries. Okay, and now the issue really becomes, as I said earlier, how do we follow a somewhat different path? Now, you have 2 questions. You have the question of leapfrogging and the question of China. And I'm not sure that they are necessarily, the answers are necessarily the same. So on China, I think the world, and I know that we have our very important political differences with China, but as a student of economics, what I have to observe is that China was responsible for a massive, what an economist would call, positive terms of trade shock for the global economy over the last 15 years, and work that has been done by, what was his name at LSE? So I think a lot of the increases in real standards of living that we have seen, I know there have been employment consequences over the last 15 years, has been because China has been such an efficient producer of tradable goods. Okay, so we have all benefited from that. It's a different matter that some of this economic interdependence is being weaponized now and what have you. Why is that relevant to your question? Why that's relevant to your question is that if India itself wishes to become a efficient, low-cost producer, it must look to the low-cost sources of inputs, and rightly or wrongly, or like it or not, maybe is the better way to put it, those are and will continue to be from China. But as Chinese costs rise, that vacates space, and that's the space that India should attempt to occupy in a number of fields. Okay. So that's the China issue, but there's a different dimension to the China issue, which is that everybody's become a bit more wary of all your eggs in one basket. And yes, there is therefore a China plus one opportunity out there. And I think it's important to observe that India is the only large economy with sufficient scale to be serious. But the reality is, at the moment, probably Vietnam is doing better than we are on manufacturers. But we should have the opportunity to operate at a different scale. I just wanted to say that I wouldn't assume that we are in recession, and I wouldn't assume that we are deglobalizing. I think there's a lot more either dynamism or inertia in the system. And yes, some cautious bets are being made by multinationals because of the geopolitical difficulties between the US and China. But I'm not sure that those are necessarily echoed in the relationship between Europe and China. So I think that certain industries where the US is the leader are going to be forced to make choices. So I would say that it's not a question of leapfrogging. It is now a question of a different development path and putting in place incentives and policies of a kind that we saw in our last budget, which guides the economy in that direction.
Lord Billimore, would you have something to add on this?
Well, the point is, I mean, China, the trade that, just to build on what Mr. Berry said, the trade that India does with China is about $150 billion. It's a lot of it is one way, and it's much more, over 110 of that is importing from China. Similarly, the UK, the trade that we do with China, with all the issues we have with China, is almost 100 billion pounds. So it is a country that is there, that is, as I said earlier, is a superpower now, is something that we have to deal with. But I think India's growth path is going to be absolutely amazing. The rate at which it's going, the entrepreneurial spirit that has been unleashed in India, combined with the educational side of things that's going, with India opening up so rapidly, with the infrastructure investments that have taken place, as long as it can carry on attracting inward investment as well with the states. I mean, the other aspect of your job is one of the most challenging jobs, because you're in the center dealing with 29 states and union territories, each one, as you say, the size of huge countries, and to coordinate that from the center to try and deal with that. But the positive is the states competing with each other. And that's actually a positive dynamic for an investor coming in from the outside. So I think India harnessing that going forward is, and I agree, leapfrogging is maybe not the right term, but certainly India could and should go ahead of China in a much more democratically robust way that is more friendly to dealing with the whole world and partnering with the whole world. And we now, by the way, in the UK, we don't talk about the Asia-Pacific anymore. We talk about the Indo-Pacific. It literally is part of our integrated strategies. It's been published by the UK government recently. We've got a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. That's how important India is to a country like the UK.
What I actually find impressive, and I've been visiting India several times every year for the last 30 years, and the culture has changed. if I look at the young people in India, they're much more entrepreneurial right now. And also admire, and I think what you said, you used some words, change at scale, driven by digital platforms. And that's amazing because, in digital world, that's sort of two worlds. One is the American way and the Chinese way, but both are driven by large walled gardens of these large tech companies. And India is having a much more bottom-up democratic way of digitalization, which is showing a different way. And the different way, I think, is what is interesting in terms of can it drive large-scale change. And the success of the payment system is one thing which is clearly, showing that that can happen. I saw there was a hand back there. Please, microphone.
Hi, I'm Abhishek Gupta. I'm from Delhi, so thank you for making me feel at home today. My question is that India is slowly moving from make in India to invent in India. So how do you think the G20 summit will help accelerate the goals, both on the invent side and also on the production side?
Well, let me, in a sense, because my prepared remarks on the G20 faltered, but let me just say that as part of the challenge of helping the developing world recover from the stumbles of internal and global of COVID, India certainly is wishing to both showcase and share the point that Dean Datta stressed, which is that you don't have to depend on, and this is not very popular with the FANGs, with the large, you don't have to depend on walled garden platforms, and that indeed you are going to get, you can realize significant economic development benefits at lower cost through public digital platforms. Okay, so now your question was about both invention and production. Let me start with invention. Niti Aayog houses something called the Atal Innovation Mission, which is inculcating an innovation culture, if that's the right term, right from high schools. So there is the concept of tinkering labs at the school level, which are sustained and supported by this mission, which has its own budget outside NITI. But more importantly, it has systematized and supported so-called incubators in a variety of institutions and in a variety of fields. And it turns out, I mean, I wasn't aware of this before I got to NITI, that this is commonplace in technologic or innovation-rich societies, be it Finland, be it Silicon Valley. So that move from innovation being a hit or miss process, depending on either the individual inventor or the large corporation, to the notion that there is a life cycle of innovation that government can support through incubators. And all of this is finding expression in the G20 through there being, we've heard about the Business 20, there's now going to be a Startup 20. And India at the moment is the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. And there are about 80,000 registered startups. And there is actually more of an established financing ecosystem for startups than we actually have for external support for climate change. It's paradoxical, but that's the reality. Now, on Make in India, this has had a checkered history. And I would say that economists have not been particularly helpful to our policymakers and politicians, because they keep saying, well, you need to do a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, and the penny will drop. And frankly, it hasn't, and it doesn't, and it is a little bit of a puzzle. But I would like to just, because I think we're nearing the end of our time, talk a little bit about not how manufacturing, but why manufacturing. There is the conventional development view, which is that the way in which you increase productivity of the economy as a whole, or labor, ride the development escalator, is by moving labor from agriculture to industry, and that is happening. But there's a lot of recent research which suggests that manufacturing is becoming much more labor saving, and so even in industries like textiles, etc., it's not going to generate quite the employment dividend that it had in the past. So my own interpretation of why India is still and the Prime Minister is still very passionate about manufacturing, is that it is as much to do really with national security, that if you are to have a viable defense manufacturing business, it needs to rest on the pillars of a sophisticated manufacturing it can't be isolated, and so creating a whole network of sophisticated manufacturing will need a certain amount of import substitution, and so that is the logic behind our production-linked incentive schemes. Having said which, India is reasonably well integrated into engineering supply chains, and now it's a question of really increasing the sophistication and scale of those.
I'm mindful of the time.
Yeah, so very brief.
From you on British manufacturing, because that's a similar story.
We're out of time, and Amish, I know we've got to go. So I'll just very, very quickly. It's a very good question that you've asked, and I believe that here in the UK we neglected having a balanced economy. Our manufacturing went down from 30% of GDP in the 1970s to 10% of GDP. We're predominantly service economy, as is India. But India at least has a target of 20-25% of GDP in manufacturing. I think it's good to have that target. We've neglected, for example, nuclear power. We used to be much better at nuclear power than we are now. Now we're waking up to, and with Rolls-Royce we have these small modular reactors that we might be setting up across the country. So I think you've got to look ahead with these things, with the way of being self-reliant, but also in manufacturing is always great for exports as well. And then innovation, a lot of what Mr. Berry said now is music to my ears, to have tinkering labs in schools. I mean, I every year I give a lecture at Wickham Abbey, which is one of our most academic schools in the country. And they have 2 days compulsory in the lower sixth form. So when you're about 17 years old, 2 days compulsory to experience entrepreneurship, business, finance, management. Now, if every school in the country spent 2 days at school being exposed to it, what a difference that would make. And the final point I make is with innovation, you need to invest in R&D and innovation, and that needs to be driven by the government. Here in the UK, we underinvest. We're a very innovative country. We only spend 1.7% of GDP on R&D and innovation. Germany, 3.1%. America, 3.2%. Israel is off the charts.
South Korea.
If we spend just 1% more of GDP in the UK, that's over £20 billion more a year going into R&D and innovation. Just imagine what a difference that would make. So there is no shortcut to that. And India, with unicorns, is one of the highest number of unicorns in the world. As is this little country, the UK, less than 1% world population, we have one of the highest number of unicorns as well. And that's a good indicator of innovation.
I'm very pleased that this wonderful discussion is ending on the innovation, because that's very close to my heart. I do the innovation index. India has done very well on that. It's ranked 40th right the world, and it's going up consistently. Thank you very much, Mr. Berry, for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry about faltering at the beginning, but I think the
Comments and insights were excellent. Thank you very much, Lord Willimore.
Thank you.
And I think what I would say are two things. First of all, thank you for all the great leadership you're showing in Niti Aayog. I think it's very important for all of us inside the country, outside the country, other countries.
Yeah.
And second is, please build stronger links in Oxford and Niti Aayog in India. So we are there to help.
Thank you, and thanks all of you for being here, and those online.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.